Good afternoon and welcome to this presentation titled Title by Title Summary of the 2018 Farm Bill. Our goal here is not to do a complete comprehensive overview of all the titles because a lot of the rules are still being made by USDA, but to provide a summary of how the different titles operate, the different functions that they contain, and how they changed from the 2014 Farm Bill. So first and foremost, this was a bipartisan farm bill. This continues the trend of a couple of farm bills here to get the process through Congress into a vote that the president could sign. As some of you might remember, this bill was introduced originally in the House, and the House voted it down or failed to pass the bill because it contained several changes to the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, or the food stamp program, as some of you might remember it. And it was voted down. But the final bill, once it came out of conference committee, passed by both chambers into conference committee and then passed again, passed by some pretty historic margins. In fact, the yes vote margin for in both the Senate and the House was one of the largest we've ever had, and largest in as far as I could go back. And then President Trump signed this bill on December 20th, 2018. Something to keep in mind in relation to this farm bill was that the day it signed, the very next day, should have been day one of the Farm Bill implementation process by the United States Department of Agriculture. But December 20th was the first day of the government shutdown, and we had a month-long government shutdown that extended into January. That kind of delayed some of the action that we saw in this bipartisan farm bill, and so it kind of created some issues. The other thing that kind of slowed the process down just a little bit was in relation to the market facilitation payments that have been made to kind of alleviate some of the damage felt by retaliatory tariffs by some of our trading partners. Those payments also go through the Farm Service Agency, which was the body in charge of implementing some of the commodity programs within the Farm Bill. And so they had several things on their to-do list that they needed to work through before we could start really getting into Farm Bill implementation. So it has been passed several months ago, but we're still learning some of the rules coming out, and we hope to get more in the coming months ahead. So how does government and farm policy fit into our understanding of our industry? Ag policy has been a part of the United States official platform since the Great Depression in the 1930s, but many believe it started before that. President Lincoln established the United States Department of Agriculture. It created many of the nation's land-grant universities, including Ohio State University, and authorized the Homestead Act, allowing people to move from populated eastern coast to the heartland in the 1960s. And so that was largely all those policies relate to what we saw under President Lincoln that some people refer to as some of our first official ag policy in the United States. So as we think about some of these things that have happened, then we start thinking about crop insurance. Really started to take form in the 1930s and has gone through many adaptations since. The conservation programs largely came into play, some during that Great Depression era, a lot of them during the Nixon administration in the 1970s. And it was also the 1970s where we started to see some of our current supplemental nutrition assistance programs that then also got reworked in the 90s into the Farm Bill as well. So the Farm Bills have gained many programs over the years and has been a large bill. It continues to grow and become more omnibus-like, and we'll talk about that here at the end. But farm bills are renewed every 5 to 7 years. They always contain a sunset clause. If we do not renew a farm bill, we revert back to the permanent legislation in 1938 and 1947. A couple of big issues for that for Ohio producers is, one, we didn't plant as many soybeans back in the day as what we do now. So the soybean programs are largely irrelevant to how we operate, and as long as most of the dairy operations. We still had price supports in place back in 38 and 49 for milk prices. And so we largely see huge milk prices supported by government programs today. That's good for producers, but it would largely kill all consumption of milk. So we'd be left with these huge government expenditures. And so that's why there's sunset periods and why we renew farm policy every 5 to 7 years from the baseline. So this is just kind of an overview of the Farm Bill, the 2018 Farm Bill from a 10,000-foot view. Again, like previous Farm Bills, we see the same 12 titles showing up all the way from commodities, conservation, crop insurance, our three largest ag commodity titles. We see the nutrition programs that we're going to talk about here in the next slide represent the biggest chunk of the Farm Bill. But then we see some other things like trade. It's important to remember that trade does not include deals like the North American Free Trade Agreement, the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, but more so, how do we work and partner with some of our commodity groups across the country to help them open up offices overseas to help promote U.S. products in those markets. So it's really a trade assistance program rather than the actual trade pacts and the trade agreements like what we're seeing kind of work their way through. For the North America Free Trade Agreement, it's working its way under the new United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement. We see a couple of titles related to energy. Again, this is not the renewable fuel standard. That's outside of the Farm Bill, but does include some of the bio-assistance programs to help facilities transition to other types of bioenergy, and helps ethanol facilities if they need some assistance in like credit and availability and financing their operation. But it does not include the renewable fuel standard. And then we also see the crop insurance title, there 11, I talked about this earlier, is one of the main commodity titles in the Farm Bill. But the crop insurance program is permanently authorized outside of the Farm Bill in separate legislation, but it still shows up in farm bills to be reauthorized and given a baseline to work from and any program changes that we might have. But crop insurance is authorized in its own legislation, not within the Farm Bill. A couple of quick notes to maybe talk about real quick. The miscellaneous title on this Farm Bill was rather large. It was actually the largest title or largest increase of any of the titles over the baseline expenditures. That was largely due to animal disease facilities to help with prevention, help with vaccine readiness in case we ever had an outbreak. I think this was largely spurred by the spread of African swine fever in Asia and Eastern Europe. I think there was just a signal to Congress to provide some extra money in the miscellaneous title to help with those issues. We also see in the miscellaneous title a couple provisions for young beginning farmer and ranchers to help them make that transition and get some available credit through that way. In the trade title, again, I mentioned this is not trade pacts, but really to help with overseas marketing. We saw a huge increase in the trade title to help facilitate some of those negotiations with some of our trading partners. Again, not negotiations on a free trade pact, but negotiations on how to buy U.S. products overseas in international markets. Again, I think this was Congress's way of signaling that they recognize that there is some need for international trade assistance to help market our products overseas. And this is a partnership with commodity groups, both nationally and statewide. So if we look at the budget real quick, again, I just talked about in the previous slide, the nutrition title is 77% of this Farm Bill. It's the largest component by far. If you add in the three major commodity titles, conservation, commodities, and crop insurance, we get almost 99% of the bill. The other 8 titles make up half of 1%. So while they're not irrelevant because they contain dollar values that you and I would not consider small, they're small in the scope of the entire bill. And this split largely follows the split of previous bills. This isn't something that's just formed in this bill. We continue to see nutrition to be the biggest component. Largely, if we look at the makeup across the country, out of the 435 congressional districts, only 35 of them are considered rural. And so you got to figure out ways to appeal to those other 400 congressional districts. And nutrition programs are largely that way to get votes to pass the bill. Same way with kind of conservation. Conservation, again, is gaining a little bit of strength because both urban and rural people understand the need for conservation. So it's gaining votes and popularity. And so I think in the next couple of years, I think we can see conservation continue to pick up dollars, maybe at the expense of others, but if there's new money, I think that might go to conservation as well. Again, the cuts to nutrition did not make it into the final bill. Those were proposed by House Republicans. That was something that we've seen the last 2 farm bills where they've wanted to separate the bill between farm programs and nutrition programs in the hope to cut those nutrition or cut both. It didn't happen. The same argument for nutrition, that the economy has gotten better and more people are rolling off the nutrition programs, is largely the same reason that crop insurance proponents are also saying, hey, our program got cheaper because corn's a whole lot cheaper to insure to the government at $3.50 than $7. So both nutrition and crop insurance got cheaper. And so both had an argument of why they shouldn't get cuts. And in the end, neither one really had much. In fact, neither one of them had any major changes, very small and minor changes to both programs. If we look at title by title changes in spending across the different titles, again, this is from a previous baseline. So if we take the previous Farm Bill and extend it out 10 years, that is the baseline, and then these are the changes to the baseline over a 10-year period. Farm bills are scored on a 10-year period so we can compare apples to apples, and that's largely what we've done here. You'll notice that commodities was a little bit stronger, but crop insurance was a little bit weaker. So in the commodity programs, $263 million increase to the commodity title, $104 million decrease to crop insurance. Again, this is largely due to the fact that we didn't see major changes, but we do see some adjustment in terms of corn is cheaper to insure at the current prices, whereas commodity programs, we've allowed for programs to be chosen multiple years. So no longer in the commodity title is a producer going to have to lock in for 5 years between the agricultural risk coverage or the price loss coverage program. There's options to make those annually after this first election of a 2-year period. The other, as I've talked before previously, the trade title saw a big bump, $470 million. It was the miscellaneous title that saw the biggest increase at $738 million. Again, that's largely due to the animal disease and prevention inclusions. The rural development title saw a huge cut of $2.5 billion. That was largely due to the removal of a tax credit that rural electric co-ops got. So that tax credit went away. It provided lesser money, and so we see that big cut to the rural development title that largely paid for the increases in the other titles. In the end, if you look down there at the bottom, total we increased $70 million, and a bill that's considered 860-some billion with a B, 70 million is a rounding error or budget neutral. And so this bill is scheduled budget neutral, even though it increased federal spending by $70 million. Crazy to think about. But again, in a bill that's $863 million, this bill was scored budget neutral. So let's talk a little bit about the titles. And the commodity title, at least in the dairy side of the equation, it replaced the old margin protection program, replaced it with the new dairy margin coverage program. It added a couple new levels of coverage for milk production, especially for Tier 1, or only for Tier 1. It added an $850, a $9, and a $950 coverage level. Dairy operations are now eligible to participate in both the dairy margin coverage program and the livestock gross margin insurance for dairy. Previously, those were, you couldn't do both. You had to pick one or the other. In Ohio, we didn't see many people enrolled in the gross margin insurance program. We saw if people enrolled in a government assistance program, it was in the dairy margin coverage. But I do think the MPP program, I do think this dairy margin coverage program is better than the MPP program from the standpoint that it just provides a little more flexibility for producers, is a little more responsive to their needs, but is largely the same. If you opened up the hood for MPP and looked at it compared to DMC, you would see pretty much the same nuts and bolts that were in the MPP program. The commodity title retained both the ARC and PLC programs. It did make a few revisions to both programs, but again, kept the same nuts and bolts to the programs. A big change was, and I've mentioned this previously, that you don't have to make one 5-year decision. You get to make a decision in 19 for crop years 2019 and 2020, and then annually after that. And so this is a change that commodity groups have been advocating for a long time to allow a decision annually. It'll be something that you'll have to take active management to make the best decision for your operation every year to mitigate risk, not just thinking about revenue, but to think about what happens, what's going to cause me risk failure if something comes up. And so that's contained there. The commodity title increased the commodity loan rates for all the commodities, and so we see higher loan rates. This is going to come into effect. I don't think we're going to get to a low enough commodity price where we're going to see loan deficiency payments. But I think it will free up some extra cash in the spring for early season grain marketing and paying some input costs if you need cash during those times to make those transactions. It will allow you to put your grain on loan to the government and receive money to make those changes. And it left the sugar program alone. This is something that always comes up because the sugar program doesn't cost the taxpayers any money because it artificially locks a certain level of sugar in place. but that artificial level of sugar makes sugar more expensive to consumers in the long run. I don't think anybody would disagree with me saying that. And so the sugar program does not cause any government expenditures, and so that's always why proponents support it. But on the backside, it is a price support program, meaning that it is counting against what we are eligible for the World Trade Organization in terms of our commitments of prices and revenue to producers, right? Because a higher price means a higher revenue to producers. That's effectively transferring money from consumers to producers through a price support program. So again, proponents and opponents of the sugar program are always interested in the Farm Bill. It is left alone again this time. And then finally, the commodity title expanded the definition of family members that are eligible for payment limitations. The House bill wanted to expand payment limitations and eventually got it in the bill. The Senate wanted to retract and constrict who is eligible to get payments. They also include a reduction in the adjusted gross income cap, meaning that if you right now the adjusted gross income cap's at $900,000. If they lowered that, they had proposed lowering that down to $700,000 with just gross income being the limit to which you had to stay under to receive federal payments. The new definition allows cousins, nieces, and nephews to receive federal crop insurance or federal commodity payments. And the idea here was that if you're in transition or if something happens to you, making sure that those family members have assistance to get through that transition if something were to happen. On the conservation side, this was probably where we saw the biggest fundamental shift, but we see some of the same programs still in place. The conservation title contains the Conservation Reserve Program, that set-aside program to enroll acres in the program and not plant it, but receive a federal payment for those acres. We are currently capped at 24 million acres. The bill increased the cap of acres that are eligible to be enrolled in the program to 27 million acres, but it reduced the payment rate to 85% for general and 90% for continuous. So no more can you get 100% of the county rental rate. You can enroll more acres, but you don't get a high as a payment rate. On the working lands programs, which is the Environmental Quality Incentives Program and the Conservation Stewardship Program, the bill expanded EQIP, kind of reined in some of the expenditures on the CSP program, and then authorized EQIP over the Conservation Stewardship Program. So really kind of moving those together as one authorizing body. So the money is all kind of there together, but remain their separate identities and name. I expect in the next Farm Bill we could see these two merge together into one program. The bill did increase agriculture conservation easement programs. It did make some limits to non-agricultural land uses. So if you were thinking about parks or something, it did limit the uses there, and but did it keep it for our agriculture easement. So you can put land in saying it has to stay in cropland if you want, or ag land, and that is what those easements do. And then finally, something that's important here to Ohio, they did make the Regional Conservation Partnership Program standalone programs. One of those is the the Great Lakes region, which Ohio is a part of. So that provides money for private and public partnerships for conservation practices in those basins. There's only a few of those, like 12 are across the country, but we do have one here in Ohio, the Great Lakes region. So that was kind of important there. In relation to trade, again, this does not cover free trade agreements like KORUS, USMCA, or other trade deals, and nor does it cover market facilitation payments to help alleviate trade retaliation from some of our trading partners. But what it does is it did reauthorize Food for Peace for international food aid programs, allowing some of our food to be bought from producers to then send overseas to people that need food through the food aid program. And then it made all these programs mandatory funding. So within a Farm Bill, there's mandatory funding and non-mandatory funding. And so it made mandatory funding that way. If the bill ever did end, these programs could continue and are in the baseline. So we don't have to go in and add money for the baseline. These are now part of the baseline as well. And so again, that market access program and the foreign market development programs, those top two are the big two in terms of this title that allows us, again, to work with commodity groups and other trade organizations to help sell U.S. commodities overseas and other markets. If we look at the nutrition title, again, it's one of the biggest ones. It was left budget neutral over a 10-year period. It did create a pilot program to help incentivize fluid milk purchases for SNAP recipients. That was something that has shown up to be a little bit of a burden in terms of how do we get fluid milk purchases, or how can SNAP recipients buy fluid milk purchases when food banks don't have the access to store cold milk or have the access to store that. And so that created a pilot program for that. And then, but it did not, probably the biggest thing that happened in the nutrition title is it did not expand work requirements. That was something the House Republicans had worked into the bill on the House side, and it was a non-starter on the Senate side. And, not saying it's right or wrong, I'm just saying it didn't make it into the bill, and was probably the biggest change that didn't happen. The nutrition title does reauthorize food distribution programs with a few changes. So these are our food banks and other assistance programs. Those are reauthorized with minor changes. And then there was some new provisions for addressing food waste to help with insecurity and hunger. It's hard to believe, but we do have people in the United States that are dealing with food insecurity. And so this was largely targeted at how do we use some of this food waste that we're losing at stores and restaurants and stuff. Is there ways we can pilot that to get that to people that need food? In terms of the credit title was a little cheaper, meaning that they don't expect to spend as much money. The credit title is one of those that actually makes money on interest from loans. So the government loans money out to producers or interested parties. And then based on that interest, if you make your payment, when you bring your payment back, you're making more money. There was a couple of changes to the programs, but it authorized all the programs. One of the big things that probably happened was it did increase the loan limits for direct ownership loans, guaranteed ownership loans, and guaranteed operating loans. And you can see the adjustments there in terms of the limit increases, but this allows farms to carry a little bit more debt if they need more debt. This was something that we also saw in the 70s that ended up being a little bit of a problem for us in the 80s in terms of we just had large-scale debt, larger than we ever had. And so this is another one of those that maybe was a little bit pause for concern, because we definitely don't want to repeat the 80s, at least due to being over-leveraged, having farms that were over-leveraged, but it did increase the loan limits that farms could get within the Farm Bill through the Farm Service Agency. There is a change to young beginning farmers and ranchers and military veterans. You used to have 3 years of production records. There are now a couple of exemptions how you can substitute those provisions into the bill. So if you have school, if you've gone through education or other things, you can substitute that in for farming experience. And so that was a change there. Should help our beginning farmer and ranchers. Again, the rural development title was one of those that took the biggest hit, almost $2.5 billion. The rural development title provides assistance for public health concerns, opioid and substance abuse programs, something that's also potentially important and relevant here in Ohio. And so we do see the addition of those programs. It amended the broadband support to include grants. This is to help with rural initiatives to get broadband out to rural areas. Some of our precision data in agriculture right now is dependent on having internet access at field level, and we don't have that to the capability that we need to. So that's kind of the idea behind that. We see a reauthorization of rural business grants. So if you think of like some of your small towns that might receive a grant to help with public works like plumbing, sewer, sidewalks, those all come out of these rural business development grants. We also see a reauthorization of local and regional food programs. So these are local food bank or food programs to help with like farmers markets. We see that in the rural development title as well, to help get food to the people in these rural communities that want fresh access to fresh food. But then again, like I said, the budgeted savings came from that earned interest credit for prepayment. So they weren't having to pay interest on loans they took out, and this was part of the Rural Economic Development Loan Program. So that's where they came up with money to fund all the other titles. The Research Extension Related Matters is a title that means a lot to me because Ohio State receives money through this provision, several, along with other land-grant institutions like Central State University. It reauthorized most existing priorities programs with a few new priorities. Soil health appears several times that Congress is very interested in soil health as a program and interested in research and tangible ways to improve soil health coming out of land-grant institutions. There is interest in research around automation and how to, dairy, robotic dairies, data, big data. There's interest in those areas. And then also the barriers to young, beginning, and socially disadvantaged veterans and immigrant farmers and ranchers. This is something that's been in here for a while, and we keep seeing time and time again, largely because no one knows what to do. And so they're actually providing money and incentives for people to research ways to help beginning young farmers and ranchers. We see new investments in 1890 and 1994 institutions. In Ohio, that would be Central State. We see bigger commitments, matching funds available if state funds are available to get more money for those institutions. And then this is where we first see hemp mentioned in the Farm Bill. So it does authorize hemp for research at universities. We saw pilot programs for hemp in the 2014 Farm Bill. Some states were pilot states. Kentucky was one of those where they were able to grow hemp and do research with it, but they couldn't harvest it or process it. And so we see some more hemp research funding applied in this bill. At least from the forestry title, it's $10 million, which again, I wish I had $10 million, but this is one of the smallest titles of the Farm Bill. But at this time, at this Farm Bill, it was one of the last issues to be finalized, and it was one of the major sticking points because there was big disagreement on how to handle forage, how to handle forest, and how to manage them to prevent spread of wildfires and other diseases. There was interest in cutting this title, but like I said, their national parks and others had advocated that they needed money to manage forage and prevent wildfires in the future. And so we see competitive grants reauthorized for priority forests, none really here in Ohio, but we do see some interest in specialized forests where wildfires seem to be common. And then, like I said, forest management considerations to make sure that we're making accurate best management practices to prevent extreme wildfires if they do break out. According to the energy title, most programs were reauthorized. However, the biofuel credit is not a part of the Farm Bill. It happens outside of, and so we'll have to see if the biofuels credit gets updated. I'm always hopeful that if they want to keep updating that they do that ahead of time and not reactionary like what we've seen the last couple of ones where they've come in after the fact and said, yeah, we'll give the tax credit retroactively back a year or something like that. So it would be nice if they'd give ruling yes or no early so people can plan for it, but it is not included in the bill. We do see mandatory funding very similar to the trade title. There were several programs that received mandatory funding that are a part of the baseline now and in the equation. And then we also see some addition of algae to be used as a biomass assistance program to create fuel. So using algae as a way to make energy, gas, or fuel. In the horticulture title, this was the big one for organic agriculture. We see several programs related to that and specialty crops through block grants, research, and promotion. And we also see an interest in farmer markets and local food programs, again, very similar to what we saw in the rural development title. This is also where we saw the biggest mention of hemp. It allows states and Indian tribes to regulate industrialized hemp by decriminalizing it from the federal list of controlled substance. Ohio has not passed industrial hemp legislation yet. I put the word yet in there because it is in Congress. It's working its way through the legislature. I'm not sure if they'll pass it or if the governor will sign it, but it is working its way through. We're one of 5 states left. However, USDA will have to also make a ruling. So once all these states pass their hemp legislation, it'll have to get approved by USDA. They have not set up the regulatory framework of what they're going to approve or not. So we're really not behind the 8 ball yet, but we do see several interested parties wanting us to go ahead or wanting Ohio to go ahead so they can start investing in this area if they want to invest in Ohio hemp production, industrial hemp production. Again, crop insurance, it's permanently authorized outside the Farm Bill, so it's not contained within. There were small modifications made. Probably some of the biggest things to crop insurance, like the nutrition, were things that got proposed and then just didn't make it into the bill. The removal of the harvest price option was one thing that people had proposed doing away with. It was left intact. Removing some of the other policies that producers use but are major expenses to taxpayers, and that some producers or some legislators think to place unnecessarily financial burden on taxpayers were left out. So there are small modifications that were made. There's a couple of selected changes. One, it allows cover crops to be classified as good farming practice. There's a good farming practice handbook now put out by NRCS. I recommend you take a look at it if you ever want to use cover crops, this should help expand the use of cover crops on acres to help with some erosion, nutrient runoff. It changed and allowed farm operations to establish single enterprise units across counties. You couldn't do that prior. Now, if you have a county that qualifies for this provision, you can actually have the same enterprise units in 2 different counties. You'll just need to talk to your crop insurance agent about that. And then again, we see hemp added to a list of eligible insured crops. And so we're waiting for RMA to come out with the rules around, how is hemp going to be insured? Is there going to be a quality standard with it? What are they going to do about that THC level? Because hemp has to remain below a certain THC. What happens if that THC gets too high and you have to terminate the crop? Does that qualify for crop insurance or not? So a couple of things to keep in mind there as well. And then, like I said, the biggest news to crop insurance was what wasn't included in the bill. No added payment limitations or cuts to subsidy rates, and did not remove the harvest price option from revenue insurance plans. The miscellaneous title, as I said, was one of the major increases within the Farm Bill. A couple of big things that came out of this was the livestock programs, the National Animal Disease Response Program, as I mentioned, talking about preventing the spread of disease in the United States, and then having an animal vaccine bank and countermeasures to prevent if outbreaks of harmful diseases ever do happen. We see that in the title that it directs the Secretary to reestablish an Undersecretary for Agriculture and Rural Development. This is one of the first things Secretary Perdue did when he became Secretary of Ag, was he got rid of the Undersecretary of Rural Development and made them a assistant to his office, so directly in line. There was some disagreement on whether that was a good move or not, but Congress ultimately said we want an Undersecretary for Rural Development, so they wrote that into the bill. And then just a couple of things here. It expands assistant programs for beginning farmers and ranchers, adds $50 million there, and then makes a couple of minor changes to the U.S. Drought Monitor to help improve accuracy there. So again, this has been a quick, and I know it's been 30 minutes, but quick overview of the Farm Bill title by title, with just not really deep down in the weeds program design, or what all changed and how to work, how to base decisions off this, but really what's combined in each title and some of the big changes or not changes from the 2014 Farm Bill. This work is supported by a grant that we received from the North Central Extension Risk Management Agency, which is a part of NIFA. And so we do appreciate their work of supporting Ohio State in these efforts. And with that, thank you and have a great day.